I pulled into the gravel driveway of my father's farm at 6:14 on a Friday evening, the same way I had done nearly every weekend for the past 3 years. The Texas sun was beginning its slow descent behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the fields that had belonged to my family for over 60 years. I noticed the damage before I even turned off the engine. Fresh tire tracks, wide and deliberate, cut through my father's vegetable garden with the leisurely weight of someone who believed they owned the place. The tracks ran in a straight line from the direction of Meadowbrook Estates, the housing development that had sprung up 2 years ago on what used to be the Henderson cattle pasture. I sat in my truck for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, studying the pattern. This wasn't a wrong turn. This was a statement. My father was sitting on the front porch when I walked up, a glass of sweet tea sweating in his hand, and his eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance. Walter Keats was 71 years old, born in this house, and he had never lived anywhere else. He didn't look at me when I approached, just nodded toward the ruined garden and said, "4th time this month." His voice carried the flat tone of exhaustion rather than calm. I sat down beside him and waited. After a while, he took a sip of his tea and added, "They don't even slow down anymore." I asked who they were. He told me about the golf carts that started cutting across his land last spring, then the dog walkers who decided his fence made a convenient shortcut, and now vehicles tearing through his crops. Each violation was larger than the last, each one testing whether anyone would respond. I thought about my mother, who had started that garden decades ago. She died 11 years back, but my father kept planting the same heirloom varieties she had loved. Those plants weren't just vegetables. They were memory-given roots, and someone had driven through them like they were weeds. I asked my father if he knew who was responsible. He mentioned a name, Sandra Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. She had been circling for the past year, he explained, first with casseroles and friendly offers to help maintain the property, then with letters. My father showed me 6 of them. The early ones were framed as neighborly concern, but the later ones warned of aesthetic inconsistency, hinted at zoning complications, and offered 60% of the land's actual value with a pointed suggestion to reconsider before things became more difficult. I read that last line twice. A decade of civil engineering work, navigating county land offices, and reviewing property disputes had taught me exactly what coercion looks like when it wears professional language. Someone was manufacturing pressure, and they were betting my father was too old and too isolated to recognize the game being played against him. I walked out to the fence line as the sun dropped lower. The old barbed wire had been there since my grandfather's time, strung between cedar posts he had cut from trees on the property. I ran my hand along the wire until I found what I was looking for, a clean cut, about 20 feet from the corner post, where someone had snipped through all 3 strands. The ends weren't rusted or frayed the way they would be from natural breakage. They were bright and shiny, the work of good wire cutters wielded recently and with purpose. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the gap and the tire tracks beyond it. Meadowbrook Estates gleamed in the distance, beige stucco and terracotta roofs, a master-planned community where people paid $500,000 to pretend they lived in the country. My father's farm sat at the edge of their vision like an inconvenient truth they wanted erased. The trespassing wasn't random. The damage wasn't accidental. Someone was trying to make his life difficult enough that selling would feel like mercy. I went back to the porch and told my father I was staying through Friday. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once without asking why. I pulled out my laptop and connected to my phone's hotspot, then navigated to the county assessor's website. Within 20 minutes, I had downloaded the official deed for our property, the original survey, and the most recent plat map showing all adjacent parcels. I also pulled up the incorporation documents for Meadowbrook Estates HOA and found Sandra Whitmore listed as president since the development's founding. Tomorrow morning, I will drive to the county records office and request certified copies of everything. If Sandra Whitmore wanted to play games with property lines, I intended to know exactly where every boundary was drawn, down to the inch. I closed my laptop and looked out at the darkening fields, somewhere past the broken fence and the ruined tomatoes. A woman with a clipboard believed she could harass my father into surrender. She was counting on him being alone. She had no idea I was coming home, and she certainly had no idea what I had just decided to build against her. Monday morning came with a pale gray sky and the kind of stillness that settles over rural Texas before the heat takes hold. I was out by the fence line at 7:30, walking the perimeter with a measuring tape, notepad, and camera, documenting every cut wire and damaged post along the boundary. My father watched from the porch with his coffee, saying nothing. He knew what I was doing, even if he didn't fully understand the methodology. Documentation is not evidence until it's organized, and organization requires discipline from the beginning. I was 3/4 of the way down the eastern fence when I heard a vehicle slow on the road behind me. I didn't turn around immediately. I finished writing my notes, capped my pen, and only then looked over my shoulder to see a white Cadillac Escalade pulling onto the grass verge. The woman who stepped out was somewhere in her late 40s, with highlighted blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail and sunglasses pushed up on her forehead. She carried a leather folio under one arm like a shield and smiled as she approached. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "You must be Walter's son," she said, extending her hand while still 10 feet away. "I'm Sandra Whitmore. I don't think we've had the pleasure." I shook her hand briefly and confirmed my name. She nodded as though filing away information. "I heard you were visiting. Your father's lucky to have a family who checks in. A man his age, living alone out here. It must be a worry." Her tone was warm and concerned, the voice of someone who had practiced sounding reasonable until it became second nature. I asked what brought her out this morning. She gestured toward the fence line and said she wanted to discuss a small matter regarding the property boundary, something she hoped we could resolve as neighbors before it became complicated. I asked what kind of complication she meant. Sandra tilted her head, the way people do when delivering bad news wrapped in cotton. She explained that there had been some confusion about where the Keats property ended and the Meadowbrook common areas began. The fence was quite old, she suggested, and might not reflect the actual legal boundary. Her research indicated that a strip of land along the eastern edge could technically fall under HOA jurisdiction. The HOA would be happy to install a new fence at no cost, she added, as long as we agreed on the correct placement. I watched her face as she spoke, looking for the tell that would reveal whether she believed her own story. She didn't blink, didn't hesitate. Either she was a skilled liar, or she had repeated this narrative until she convinced herself it was true. I asked which survey she was basing her research on. She paused for just a moment, then said she would send the documents by email. I told her I would look forward to reviewing them. Sandra glanced toward the farmhouse, where my father was still visible on the porch. "I've spoken with Walter several times about this," she said. "He's a sweet man, but I don't think he fully understands the situation. This land isn't being used to its potential. The HOA has made him a fair offer, and I truly believe it would be in his best interest to consider it." I felt something tighten in my chest, a cold wire of anger that I kept carefully out of my voice. I told her my father had lived on this land for 71 years, that he was born in that house, and that his decision about selling was his alone. I also mentioned that the price in her letters was significantly below market value. Sandra's smile flickered for a fraction of a second before resetting. "Market value is subjective," she said, "especially for agricultural land that isn't producing real income. A few garden beds don't exactly constitute a working farm." I didn't respond. I simply asked her to send the survey documents and told her I would be in touch. She held my gaze a moment longer than necessary, then turned and walked back to her Escalade without another word. I waited until her vehicle disappeared before returning to the house. My father asked what she wanted, and I told him she claimed there was a boundary dispute. He shook his head slowly. His father had surveyed this land when he bought it, and the fence had stood in the same place ever since. I believed him, but belief wouldn't be enough if Sandra pushed this into legal territory. After lunch, I drove to the county records office. The building was a squat brick structure that smelled like old paper and air conditioning. I requested certified copies of the original deed from 1962, the most recent official survey, and any recorded easements affecting the parcel. The clerk, a patient woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, typed the information into her system and then looked up with a curious expression. "You're the second person to request documents on this property in 2 weeks," she said. I asked who the first was. She checked her records. Sandra Whitmore, representing the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I thanked her and waited while she printed everything. I sat in my truck and spread the papers across the steering wheel. The deed was clear, the survey was clear, and there were no recorded easements or amendments of any kind. The boundary had not changed by a single foot in over 60 years. Whatever Sandra was planning, she wasn't basing it on anything in the official record. She was inventing a dispute out of thin air, hoping my father wouldn't know enough to challenge her. I folded the documents carefully and placed them in my bag. Sandra had been laying the groundwork for this move long before I arrived. She had studied the records, crafted her narrative, and started applying pressure with the confidence of someone who expected no resistance. But she had made one critical error. She assumed that a few threatening letters and some tire tracks would be enough to break an old man's will. She assumed wrong. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, already planning my next steps. The game she thought she was playing had just changed, and she didn't even know it yet. By Tuesday noon, I had organized every county document into a binder and confirmed what I already suspected: the property boundaries hadn't changed by a single foot since my grandfather's purchase. I was reviewing the plat map on my laptop when I heard voices coming from the eastern field. Not casual conversation, but the clipped exchange of people working. I stepped onto the porch and saw something that made my stomach drop. 3 men in orange safety vests were standing on my father's land, approximately 40 feet inside the fence line. One of them was driving a wooden stake into the ground with a mallet, while the others positioned surveying equipment. My father was already walking toward them, his shoulders tight with a tension I rarely saw in him. I caught up to him before he reached the men and told him to let me handle it. He didn't argue, just stopped and crossed his arms, watching from a distance. I approached the survey crew with my phone already recording in my pocket. Texas is a one-party consent state for audio recording, which means I didn't need their permission to document the conversation. The man with the mallet looked up as I approached, and I asked him calmly who had authorized them to be on this property. He said they were contracted by the Meadowbrook Estates HOA to conduct a boundary survey. I told him this was private land, not HOA property, and asked if he had written permission from the landowner. He looked confused, then said the HOA representative had assured them access was not an issue. Before he could say more, I heard tires on gravel and turned to see Sandra Whitmore's white Escalade pulling up to the fence gap where someone had cut the wire. Sandra stepped out with her leather folio and walked toward us with practiced confidence. "Brandon," she said, as though we were old friends, "I see you've met our survey team. I thought it might be easier to show you in person what we're dealing with." I asked her to explain why she had sent workers onto property she didn't own without obtaining consent from the owner. She smiled patiently, the way an adult might smile at a child who doesn't understand something obvious. She opened her folio and pulled out a printed map, unfolding it on the hood of her vehicle. "This is the development plan for Meadowbrook Estates," she said, pointing to a highlighted section along the eastern boundary. "The original planning documents show that this strip here, approximately 30 feet wide, was designated as a community greenway buffer. The previous fence was placed incorrectly, and we're simply trying to establish the accurate boundary." The map was professionally printed with the Meadowbrook logo and what appeared to be official survey markings. I asked Sandra where she had obtained this document. She said it came from the original development files, provided by the construction company that built Meadowbrook. I asked if it had been recorded with the county. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before saying that the recording process was still pending. That hesitation told me everything. I informed her that I had certified copies of every recorded document affecting this parcel, and none of them showed any greenway buffer or boundary adjustment. A developer cannot unilaterally redraw the boundaries of adjacent private property, regardless of what their internal planning documents claim. Sandra's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. She folded the map and slid it back into her folio. "Perhaps we should schedule a meeting with the HOA board to discuss this properly," she said. I told her the only discussion I was interested in involved actual legal documents filed with the county recorder. Until then, I expected her and anyone working on her behalf to stay off my father's land. I turned to the survey crew and informed them clearly that they were trespassing on private property without authorization. The lead surveyor looked at Sandra, then at me, and made his decision. He told his team to pack up. Sandra watched them with a tight expression, then turned to me and said something I made sure to capture on my recording. "Your father is making this more difficult than it needs to be," she said. "This land is going to be developed eventually, one way or another. The only question is whether your family benefits from that process or gets left behind." I didn't respond. I simply watched as she returned to her vehicle and drove away, followed by the survey truck. When they were gone, my father walked over and stood beside me, looking at the wooden stake they had driven into his soil. I pulled it out of the ground and carried it back to the house, another piece of evidence for the binder, whether Sandra realized it or not. That evening, as the sun was setting, I heard a knock at the front door. I opened it to find a woman I didn't recognize, maybe early 40s, with tired eyes and nervous as energy. She introduced herself as Megan Hartley and said she lived in Meadowbrook Estates. She glanced over her shoulder as though checking whether anyone had followed her, then asked if she could speak with me privately. I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. Megan told me she had seen what happened earlier, watched from her backyard as the survey crew set up on our land and Sandra arrived to supervise. She said she had been wanting to talk to someone for months, but hadn't known who to trust. According to Megan, Sandra had told the HOA board in a closed meeting that the Keats property was disputed territory and that the association had legal grounds to use it for community purposes. Several residents had questioned this, but Sandra dismissed their concerns and warned that anyone who interfered would face fines and penalties. Megan said she was a nurse and a single mother who couldn't afford to be targeted, but she also couldn't stay silent anymore. I thanked her and promised to protect her identity as long as possible. She gave me her phone number and disappeared into the twilight toward Meadowbrook. I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, where my father was finishing his dinner. He asked who was at the door. I told him we had just gained an ally on the inside. He looked at me for a long moment, then said something that stayed with me. "Your mother always said that people show you who they are if you pay attention long enough. Sounds like Sandra's been showing the whole neighborhood." I nodded and opened my laptop. The folder I had started was no longer just documentation. It was becoming architecture, and Sandra had just handed me another load-bearing wall. Wednesday began with a phone call to a licensed surveyor in the neighboring county. I chose someone outside the immediate area deliberately, wanting to avoid any potential connection to Meadowbrook or its network of contractors. The surveyor, a man named Paul Drucker, who had been in the business for 30 years, listened as I explained the situation and agreed to come out on Thursday morning. His fee was $450 for a full boundary survey with a certified report. I told him I would pay double if he could expedite the results. He said the standard fee would be fine, and he would have the report ready by Friday afternoon. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and began drafting a cease and desist letter. I had consulted briefly with a real estate attorney in Austin the night before, a colleague of a colleague who agreed to review my draft for a reduced fee. The cease took me 3 hours to get right. I addressed it to Sandra Whitmore in her capacity as president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, with a copy to the HOA's registered agent on file with the state. The letter outlined each documented instance of trespassing, including dates, times, and the nature of the incursions onto my father's property. It referenced the official deed and survey records, stated unequivocally that no portion of the Keats property fell under HOA jurisdiction, and demanded that all unauthorized entry cease immediately. The final paragraph explained that any further trespassing would result in formal complaints to law enforcement and potential civil action for damages. I printed 3 copies, signed each one, and drove to the post office to send them via certified mail with return receipt requested. The postal clerk stamped the tracking numbers onto my receipts, and I photographed each one before leaving. My next stop was the county sheriff's office. The building sat at the edge of town, a low-slung structure with brown brick walls and a parking lot full of patrol vehicles. I asked to speak with a deputy about filing a trespassing complaint and was directed to a desk near the back, where a man in his 40s with a calm demeanor and a name tag reading Deputy Tom Reyes was finishing some paperwork. I introduced myself and explained the situation as concisely as I could, showing him the photographs of the tire tracks, the cut fence wire, and the survey crew on our land. I played him the audio recording of Sandra Whitmore stating that the development of our property was inevitable. One way or another, Deputy Reyes listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked how long this had been going on. I told him the incidents had been escalating for approximately a year, but the documentation I was providing covered only the past week. He nodded and said that was actually better from an evidentiary standpoint. Recent, well-documented incidents carried more weight than older complaints without supporting proof. Deputy Reyes explained the process. He would file an incident report based on my complaint, creating an official record with the Sheriff's Department. If the trespassing continued after Sandra received the cease and desist letter, each subsequent incident could be treated as a separate offense. In Texas, criminal trespass is a Class B misdemeanor if the property is agricultural land and the trespasser has received notice to stay off. The cease constituted a legal notice, meaning any entry onto the property after its receipt would meet the threshold for criminal charges. He gave me his card and told me to call directly if there were any further incidents. I thanked him and left with a copy of the incident report number, which I added to my growing file. I spent Thursday morning installing a security camera system around the property. I had ordered the equipment online to 2 days earlier and paid for expedited shipping. The system included 4 weatherproof cameras with night vision capability, a central recording unit with cloud backup, and motion-activated alerts sent directly to my phone. I positioned the cameras at strategic points along the fence line, focusing on areas where previous incursions had occurred. Each camera had a timestamp function that couldn't be edited. My father watched me work from his usual spot on the porch, occasionally bringing me water or holding a ladder steady. At one point, he asked if all this was really necessary. I told him that when someone lies about boundaries, the only answer is evidence they can't dispute. That evening, Megan Hartley called with an update. Sandra had received my cease and desist letter that afternoon and had apparently reacted poorly. According to Megan, Sandra had called an emergency meeting of the HOA board to discuss what she termed hostile legal action from the Keats family. She had characterized my letter as an attack on the community and suggested the HOA might need to retain its own attorney. Several board members had expressed concern about the escalation, but Sandra shut down the discussion by reminding them she had been managing this situation from the beginning. Megan also mentioned that Sandra had started circulating a petition among residents, asking them to sign a statement supporting the HOA's position on the boundary dispute. The petition claimed that the Keats property was an eyesore that negatively impacted home values and community aesthetics. I thanked Megan for the information and asked her to keep me informed. After I hung up, I sat alone on the porch as the stars came out over the fields. Part of me wanted to drive to Meadowbrook right then, knock on Sandra Whitmore's door, and tell her exactly what I thought of her fabricated maps and manufactured disputes. The anger was there, coiled tight in my chest, waiting for permission to strike. But anger is a poor tool for the kind of work that needs to be done. Sandra wanted me to react, to overreach, to give her something she could point to as evidence of aggression from our side. I would not give her that satisfaction. I would give her something far worse. I would give her a case so meticulously assembled that when it finally arrived on a judge's desk, there would be no room for interpretation, just facts, evidence, and consequences. Friday afternoon, 2 things arrived within hours of each other. The first was Paul Drucker's survey report, delivered by email with a certified hard copy to follow. His findings confirmed that the boundary of the Keats property matched the original deed exactly, and the existing fence line was accurate to within 6 inches along its entire length. No 30-foot buffer zone, no greenway easement, no discrepancy of any kind. The second arrival was an email from Sandra Whitmore herself, sent from her personal account with the HOA letterhead attached. She had included a PDF of the same fabricated map she had shown me at the fence line, along with a message stating that she was providing documentation to support the HOA's position, and hoped I would review it objectively. I saved the email to my evidence folder, along with the metadata showing the time and date of transmission. She had just sent me, in writing, proof of her own deception. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a small, cold smile. Every beam was in place now, every joint secured. The only question left was how much weight Sandra would put on it before the whole thing came down on her head. The invitation arrived Saturday morning, slipped under the front gate sometime during the night. It was printed on heavy cardstock, with the Meadowbrook Estates logo embossed in gold at the top, announcing a community town hall to be held Sunday evening at the clubhouse. The stated purpose was to address ongoing concerns regarding property boundaries and community development. My name wasn't on the invitation, but the timing made it clear who the intended audience was. Megan called an hour later to confirm what I already suspected. Sandra had spent the past 2 days rallying residents, framing the meeting as a chance for the community to stand united against what she called outside interference in HOA affairs. According to Megan, Sandra planned to present her version of the boundary dispute and ask residents to vote on authorizing legal action against my father. I thanked Megan for the warning and told her I would be there. She paused for a long moment before saying she would try to attend as well, though she couldn't promise to speak up publicly. I told her I understood and that her presence alone would be enough. I spent the rest of Saturday preparing. I made copies of the key documents Paul Drucker's certified survey report, the original deed from the county records, and a printout of Sandra's email with the fabricated map attached. I also prepared a simple one-page summary comparing the official boundary measurements to the claims in Sandra's document, with the discrepancies highlighted in red. I wasn't planning to give a presentation or make a SOAS speech. I simply wanted to be ready if the opportunity arose to introduce facts into whatever narrative Sandra was constructing. My father asked if he should come with me. I told him it would be better if he stayed home. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about observation and, if necessary, strategic correction. He nodded and said he trusted my judgment, then went back to reading his newspaper on the porch. I noticed his hands were steadier than they had been in a week ago. Having a plan, even someone else's plan, seemed to have restored something in him that the months of harassment had worn away. Sunday evening arrived with a copper-colored sunset that made the Meadowbrook clubhouse glow like something out of a real estate brochure. The parking lot was nearly full when I pulled in, and I counted approximately 40 cars, which suggested a significant turnout. I walked in with my folder tucked under my arm and found a seat near the back of the main room, where rows of folding chairs faced a small stage with a podium and a projection screen. Sandra stood near the front, greeting residents with handshakes and warm smiles, every inch the concerned community leader. She noticed me almost immediately. Her smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind her eyes, a quick calculation followed by what looked almost like satisfaction. She wanted me here. She thought my presence would help her narrative, the aggressive outsider disrupting a peaceful community. I settled into my chair and waited. The meeting began at 7 sharp. Sandra took the podium and welcomed everyone, thanking them for coming on short notice to address a matter of considerable importance to our community's future. She spoke for several minutes about the values that made Meadowbrook special, the investment residents had made in their homes, and the responsibility the HOA had to protect those investments. Then she clicked a remote, and the projection screen lit up with a familiar image. It was the fabricated map, the same one she had shown me at the fence line and later emailed as documentation. She explained that this map represented the original development plan for Meadowbrook, which showed a 30-foot greenway buffer along the eastern boundary that had been incorrectly excluded when the neighboring farm's fence was built. The Keats property, she said, was encroaching on land that rightfully belonged to the community. She paused to let that sink in, then added that she had made multiple good-faith attempts to resolve this issue privately, but the Keats family had responded with threats and legal intimidation. She held up my cease and desist letter and read selected passages aloud, her voice heavy with disappointment. I waited until she finished before raising my hand. Sandra acknowledged me with a tight smile and said she would be happy to take questions after the presentation. I told her I didn't have a question, but I did have some documents that might be relevant to the discussion. The room went quiet. Sandra's smile thinned, but she gestured for me to continue. I stood and walked to the front of the room, where I handed her a copy of the certified survey report and the original deed. I explained that I had hired an independent licensed surveyor to verify the property boundaries, and his findings confirmed that the Keats fence line was accurate to within 6 inches of the original deed recorded in 1962. I also pointed out that the development plan she had presented was not a recorded legal document and had no bearing on actual property boundaries. A developer's internal planning map cannot override a deed that has been on file with the county for over 60 years. I kept my voice calm, factual, almost conversational. I wasn't accusing anyone of anything. I was simply presenting evidence. Sandra's composure began to crack. She interrupted me to say that the survey I had commissioned was biased and that the HOA had its own documentation proving the boundary discrepancy. I asked her if that documentation had been recorded with the county. She hesitated, then said the recording was in process. I pointed out that she had told me the same thing 5 days ago, and I was curious how long this process typically took. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. One man near the front asked Sandra directly whether the map she had shown was an official county document or not. Sandra began to explain that official status was a matter of interpretation, and that's when I saw her control slip completely. She turned to me with genuine anger in her eyes and said that my father was holding this community hostage with his refusal to sell. She said the land was going to be developed eventually, and the only question was whether the Keats family would cooperate or be left behind. The room went very still. A woman in the third row stood up. It was Megan. She asked Sandra to clarify what she meant by left behind. Sandra blinked, seeming to realize she had said too much, and tried to walk the statement back. She said she only meant that the community's growth shouldn't be held back by one stubborn holdout. Megan asked if that was why survey crews had been sent onto the Keats property without permission. Sandra denied authorizing any trespassing, and I quietly mentioned that I had a recording of her supervising that exact survey crew on my father's land. The murmur that went through the room told me everything I needed to know. Sandra called for order and announced that the meeting was adjourned, saying the board would discuss the matter further in executive session. Residents began filing out, many of them glancing at me, with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something approaching respect. A few stopped to introduce themselves and say they hadn't realized the full picture of what was happening. One older man shook my hand and told me his wife had refused to sign Sandra's petition because something about it felt wrong. I thanked him and made my way to the parking lot, where Megan caught up with me near my truck. She was slightly out of breath and looked shaken, but also relieved. She told me that another resident had been recording the entire meeting on his phone and had already agreed to share the footage with her. Sandra's statement about my father being left behind was captured clearly, along with her admission that the development plan wasn't officially recorded. I thanked Megan and told her she had shown real courage by speaking up. She shook her head and said she had just asked a question. I told her sometimes that's all it takes. I drove home under a sky full of stars, thinking about what had just happened. Sandra had called the meeting expecting to consolidate her power, to turn the community against my father and authorize legal action with a show of democratic support. Instead, she had exposed her own deception in front of 40 witnesses and made statements that could be used against her in court. She had built a stage for her own unmasking and hadn't even realized it until the lights came up. When I got back to the farm, my father was still awake, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. He asked how it went. I sat down beside him and said that Sandra had done most of the work for us. He nodded slowly, looking out at the dark fields, and said something I wouldn't forget. Some people dig their own holes. You just have to make sure you're not standing in the way when they fall in. I couldn't have said it better myself. Monday morning, I cleared the kitchen table and began the work of transforming a folder of evidence into a formal legal case. The materials I had accumulated over the past week covered nearly every surface photographs, recordings, official documents, witness statements, and a timeline that stretched back over a year. My father made coffee and retreated to the porch, understanding without being told that this was the kind of work that required silence and concentration. I started by organizing everything chronologically, creating a master document that listed each incident with its corresponding evidence. The tire tracks in the garden, documented with photographs and dated entries. The cut fence wire, photographed from multiple angles with measurements. The unauthorized survey crew, captured on audio recording, along with Sandra's admission that development was inevitable. The fabricated map, preserved in email form with metadata intact. And now, the town hall meeting, recorded by a Meadowbrook resident who had already sent Megan a copy of the footage, each piece connected to the next, forming a chain of behavior that no reasonable person could dismiss as a coincidence or a misunderstanding. I spent 2 hours on the phone with the real estate attorney in Austin, who had reviewed my cease and desist letter. His name was Richard Castellano, and he had 30 years of experience handling property disputes in Texas. I walked him through the entire situation, from the initial trespassing incidents to Sandra's public statements at the town hall. He listened carefully, asked pointed questions about documentation and witnesses, and then gave me his assessment. We had more than enough evidence to file a civil complaint for trespassing, harassment, and attempted fraud. The trespassing charges were straightforward, supported by photographs, recordings, and the testimony of Megan Hartley, who had witnessed the survey crew incident firsthand. The harassment claim was bolstered by the pattern of escalating pressure documented in Sandra's letters and her statements at the meeting. The fraud element was trickier but viable, given that Sandra had repeatedly presented a fabricated document as legitimate in an apparent attempt to coerce my father into selling his property below market value. Castellano recommended filing in justice court, where disputes involving claims under $20,000 could be resolved relatively quickly and without the expense of a full civil trial. I asked him about the possibility of criminal charges. He explained that while criminal trespass was technically a misdemeanor in Texas, prosecutors rarely pursued such cases unless there was clear evidence of malicious intent or repeated violations after formal notice. The cease and desist letter I had sent established that notice, which meant any future trespassing could potentially be prosecuted. However, the more practical path was to focus on the civil case and let the evidence speak for itself. A judgment against Sandra and the HOA would create a public record of their misconduct and establish clear legal boundaries that could be enforced going forward. He offered to handle the filing for a flat fee of $1,500, which included representation at the hearing. I told him I would call him back by the end of the day, before committing to legal representation. I wanted to make sure I had every piece of the puzzle in place. I called Megan and asked if she would be willing to provide a formal written statement about what she had witnessed. She hesitated, and I understood why. Speaking up at a public meeting was one thing, but putting her name on a legal document meant exposing herself to potential retaliation from Sandra and the HOA. I told her I wouldn't pressure her, but I also explained that her testimony could make the difference between a case that succeeded and one that stalled. She asked for a day to think about it. That evening, she called back and said she was in. She had spent the afternoon reviewing the HOA bylaws and discovered that Sandra had exceeded her authority on multiple occasions, including authorizing the survey crew without board approval and misrepresenting the status of the boundary dispute to residents. Megan was tired of being afraid. She said she wanted to do what was right. I told her I would draft a statement for her review and thanked her for her courage. Tuesday morning, I drove back to the county seat and filed the formal complaint at the Justice of the Peace office. The clerk, the same patient woman who had helped me before, walked me through the paperwork and accepted the filing fee of $75. The complaint named Sandra Whitmore individually and the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association as defendants, alleging trespassing, harassment, and fraudulent misrepresentation regarding property boundaries. I attached copies of all supporting evidence, including the certified survey report, the fabricated map email, the audio recordings, and Megan's signed statement. The clerk stamped the documents and told me a hearing date would be assigned within 2 weeks. I walked out of the courthouse with a case number and the knowledge that the machinery of formal justice was now in motion. That afternoon, I received a call from Richard Castellano. Sandra's attorney had reached out to him, he said, requesting an informal conversation about resolving the matter without litigation. Apparently, Sandra had received notice of the complaint and was concerned about the potential publicity. Her attorney proposed a settlement. The HOA would agree to respect the existing property boundaries and cease all contact with the Keats family in exchange for withdrawal of the complaint and a mutual non-disclosure agreement. I asked Castellano what he thought. He said it was a reasonable offer if my goal was simply to make the harassment stop. But if I wanted accountability, if I wanted a formal record that established wrongdoing and prevented Sandra from trying the same tactics on someone else, then I should reject the settlement and proceed to the hearing. I told him I would think about it overnight and let him know in the morning. I sat on the porch that evening with my father, watching the sun go down behind the tree line. I told him about the settlement offer and asked what he thought we should do. He was quiet for a long time, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. Finally, he said that when his father bought this land, there were people who told him a man like him had no business owning property. They tried to cheat him on the deed, shortchange him on supplies, and make his life difficult enough that he would give up and go somewhere else. But his father kept records of everything. My dad said, every receipt, every agreement, every handshake that turned out to be a lie. And when he finally had enough evidence, he took it to a judge and made sure everyone in the county knew what had been done to him. It wasn't about the money, my father said. It was about making sure it was written down somewhere official, so no one could ever pretend it didn't happen. He looked at me and said that whatever I decided, he would support, but he thought his father would have wanted to see it through. I called Castellano the next morning and told him to reject the settlement. We were going to court. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning, before Justice of the Peace Leon Barrett. I had 11 days to prepare. I intended to use every one of them. Thursday morning arrived with a clear blue sky and the kind of stillness that felt almost ceremonial. I put on the same navy suit I wore to client meetings in Austin, checked my evidence binder one last time, and drove to the county courthouse with my father in the passenger seat. He had insisted on coming, saying he wanted to see the thing through with his own eyes. He wore a pressed white shirt and the bolo tie my mother had given him for their 40th anniversary, the one with the turquoise stone she had picked out herself at a market in Santa Fe. I didn't mention the tie, but I understood what it meant. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about everything that property represented, every memory it held, every promise it stood for. The courthouse was a modest 2-story building with limestone walls and tall windows that let the morning light flood the hallways. We found the correct room on the 2nd floor, a small chamber with wooden benches and an elevated desk where Justice of the Peace Leon Barrett would preside. Sandra Whitmore was already there when we arrived, seated at a table on the left side of the room with her attorney, a polished man in his 50s, whose name I later learned was Gregory Foss. Sandra wore a cream-colored blazer and an expression of controlled neutrality, though I noticed her fingers tapping against the table in a rhythm that suggested she was less calm than she appeared. A few other people were scattered across the benches behind her. Residents from Meadowbrook I recognized from the town hall meeting. Megan was not among them, which didn't surprise me. She had submitted her written statement and offered to appear if subpoenaed, but we had agreed it was better not to expose her unnecessarily before the hearing required it. Richard Castellano arrived a few minutes after us and took his place at the table on the right side of the room. We exchanged nods but didn't speak. Everything that needed to be said had already been discussed in preparation. At precisely 10 o'clock, Justice Leon Barrett entered through a side door and took his seat behind the elevated desk. He was a man in his mid-50s, with gray hair cut short, and a face that suggested decades of listening to disputes without being impressed by any of them. He opened a folder, reviewed its contents, and then looked up at both parties. He explained that this was a civil hearing, not a criminal trial, and that his role was to evaluate the evidence presented and render a judgment based on the merits of the case. He asked if both parties were ready to proceed. Castellano and Foss confirmed that they were. Barrett nodded and invited the complainant to present first. Castellano stood and began with a clear, methodical overview of the case, establishing the key facts without embellishment. He described the pattern of trespassing incidents, the escalating pressure to sell, and the presentation of a fabricated document as part of an apparent scheme to defraud my father of his property. Then it was my turn to present the evidence. I had organized it into 3 distinct sections, each building on the last. The first section established the legitimate boundaries of the property. I presented the certified survey report from Paul Drucker, which confirmed that the fence line was accurate to within 6 inches of the original deed recorded over 60 years ago. I also submitted the deed itself, along with documentation from the county recorder's office showing that no easements, amendments, or boundary adjustments had ever been filed against the parcel. Barrett examined each document carefully, asking a few clarifying questions about survey methodology before setting them aside. The second section documented the pattern of trespassing. I presented photographs of the tire tracks, the cut fence wire, and the unauthorized survey crew. I played the audio recording of Sandra supervising that crew and stating that development was inevitable, one way or another. Barrett listened to the recording twice, his expression unreadable. The third section addressed the fabricated map. I submitted the email Sandra had sent me, complete with metadata showing the date and time of transmission, along with a side-by-side comparison of her development plan and the official county survey. The discrepancies were highlighted in red, showing a 30-foot strip of my father's land that Sandra had simply drawn into the HOA's territory with no legal basis whatsoever. Gregory Foss presented Sandra's defense with the confident tone of someone who had done this many times before. He argued that the boundary dispute was a good-faith disagreement based on ambiguous historical records, and that his client had acted reasonably in attempting to clarify the situation. He characterized the survey crew incident as a misunderstanding and suggested that my cease and desist letter had escalated a minor neighborly dispute into unnecessary litigation. He submitted letters from several Meadowbrook residents attesting to Sandra's character and her dedication to the community. Barrett accepted the letters without comment and then asked Foss a direct question. He wanted to know whether the development plan his client had presented was a recorded legal document or an internal planning map with no official status. Foss hesitated for just a moment before admitting that the document had not been recorded with the county. Barrett made a note and asked if Sandra wished to make a statement. What happened next would stay with me for a long time. Sandra stood and began speaking in a measured tone, explaining that she had only ever wanted what was best for the community. She described the challenges of managing a homeowners association, the complaints she received about the eyesore farm next door, and the pressure from residents who felt their property values were being affected. She said she had tried to resolve the situation amicably, but the Keats family had been uncooperative and hostile from the beginning. Then Barrett asked her a simple question. He asked why, if her goal was simply to clarify a boundary dispute, she had sent letters offering to buy the property at below market value. Sandra's composure cracked. She said the offers were made in good faith, that the land wasn't being used productively, that a man of my father's age shouldn't have to worry about maintaining such a large property. Barrett asked if she had any documentation showing that the property was actually worth less than market value. She didn't. He asked if she had consulted with a licensed appraiser before making her offers. She hadn't. Then he asked, very quietly, whether her interest in this property had anything to do with the planned Phase 2 expansion of Meadowbrook Estates, which, according to public planning documents, would require additional land along the eastern boundary. The room went silent. Sandra's attorney tried to object, but Barrett waved him off. He said the question was relevant to establishing motive. Sandra stared at him for a long moment, and I watched her calculate whether to lie. She chose not to. She admitted that yes, there had been discussions about future expansion, and yes, the Keats property would be ideal for that purpose, but she insisted that her actions had been motivated by community interest, not personal gain. Barrett asked if she personally held any financial stake in the development company behind Meadowbrook. Foss objected again, more forcefully this time, and Barrett sustained the objection. But the damage was done. Sandra had admitted on the record that she had a vested interest in acquiring my father's land, and that her repeated trespassing and fabricated boundary claims had occurred in that context. She sat down heavily, no longer bothering to maintain her neutral expression. Barrett announced that he had heard enough to render a judgment, but would take a 15-minute recess to review his notes. The room emptied slowly, people filing out into the hallway to stretch their legs and whisper to each other. My father stayed seated, his hands folded in his lap, looking at the empty desk where Barrett had been sitting. I asked him how he was doing. He turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read and said that he had waited a long time to hear someone in authority ask the right questions. Then he looked toward the door where Sandra had exited and added that some people spend so long believing their own stories that they forget other people can tell the difference. We sat together in the quiet courtroom, waiting for Barrett to return and deliver his verdict. The recess lasted exactly 17 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock on the courtroom wall, counting each minute as it passed while my father sat motionless beside me. When Justice Barrett returned, he carried himself with the same unhurried composure he had shown throughout the hearing. but there was something in his expression that suggested he had concluded he felt certain about. He settled into his chair, arranged his notes in front of him, and looked out at the room with the calm authority of a man who had spent decades separating truth from convenient fiction. Sandra and her attorney had resumed their positions at the opposite table, and I noticed that she no longer made any effort to appear composed. Her shoulders were tight, her jaw set, and her eyes fixed on Barrett with the wary intensity of someone who already knew what was coming but hadn't yet accepted it. Barrett began by summarizing the key facts of the case, establishing the foundation for his ruling. He noted that the complainant had presented certified documentation proving that the property boundaries had remained unchanged since the original deed was recorded, and that no legal basis existed for the defendant's claims regarding a greenway buffer or boundary adjustment. He observed that the defendant had admitted under questioning that her development plan was not a recorded document and had no official status with the county. He referenced the audio recording in which the defendant had stated that the property would be developed one way or another, which he characterized as evidence of intent to pressure the landowner through means other than legitimate negotiation. He mentioned the testimony regarding unauthorized entry by a survey crew operating under the defendant's direction and the pattern of escalating contact documented in the letters submitted as evidence. Then he paused, removed his reading glasses, and delivered his judgment in plain language that left no room for ambiguity. On the matter of trespassing, Barrett found in favor of the complainant. The evidence clearly established that agents acting under the defendant's authority had entered private property without permission on multiple occasions, causing damage to crops and fencing. He ordered the defendant to pay $4,500 in damages to cover the cost of destroyed vegetables, fence repairs, and the independent survey commissioned to establish the true boundary. On the matter of harassment, Barrett found that the pattern of letters, visits, and public statements constituted a coordinated campaign designed to pressure an elderly landowner into selling his property below market value. While this did not rise to the level of criminal harassment under Texas law, it demonstrated a pattern of conduct that the court found troubling and relevant to the overall case. On the matter of fraudulent misrepresentation, Barrett stopped short of a formal fraud finding, but noted that the defendant had repeatedly presented a fabricated document as legitimate in both private and public settings, and that this conduct raised serious questions about her fitness to hold a position of trust within her community. The final element of the ruling was the one that mattered most to me. Barrett issued a permanent injunction prohibiting Sandra Whitmore, the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and any agents acting on their behalf from entering the Keats property without explicit written permission from the landowner. Any violation of this injunction would be treated as contempt of court and could result in fines, additional damages, or criminal referral, depending on the severity of the offense. He ordered that a copy of the injunction be filed with the county recorder's office and the sheriff's department, creating a permanent public record of the ruling. He concluded by stating that property rights are fundamental to the American legal system, and that no homeowners association, regardless of its size or resources, has the authority to redraw boundaries or intimidate neighbors into surrendering land that lawfully belongs to them. He thanked both parties for their participation and declared the hearing concluded. Sandra left the courtroom without looking at me, her attorney close behind, murmuring something I couldn't hear. A few of the Meadowbrook residents who had come to support her lingered in the hallway, their expressions uncertain, as if they were still processing what they had witnessed. One of them, a man I recognized from the town hall meeting, caught my eye and nodded once before turning away. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, and that was enough. My father shook Richard Castellano's hand and thanked him for his work. Castellano said it had been one of the more satisfying cases he had handled in recent years, and that he hoped we wouldn't need his services again anytime soon. We walked out of the courthouse into the midday sun, and my father paused on the steps to look up at the sky. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he put his hand on my shoulder and said that my mother would have been proud of how I handled this. I told him she would have been proud of both of us. The aftermath unfolded over the following weeks in ways I hadn't entirely anticipated. Megan called 3 days after the hearing to tell me that Sandra had been removed from her position as HOA president. The board had held an emergency meeting, and a majority had voted to accept her resignation, which she had offered under pressure after several residents demanded accountability for her conduct. The petition she had circulated against my father was formally withdrawn, and a new board member sent my father a letter of apology on behalf of the association. It wasn't much, but it was something. More importantly, the injunction was now part of the public record, which meant that anyone who searched the property history would find documentation of exactly what had happened and who was responsible. Sandra Whitmore's name would be attached to this case forever, a permanent reminder that actions have consequences, even when you believe yourself untouchable. I spent a weekend in late spring helping my father rebuild the fence along the eastern boundary. We used new cedar posts cut from trees on the property, just as my grandfather had done when he first strung the wire 60 years earlier. We installed metal signs at regular intervals, white letters on a red background reading, "Private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted." At each corner post, I attached a small weatherproof placard displaying the GPS coordinates of the boundary, so there could never again be any confusion about where our land ended and theirs began. My father worked alongside me without complaint, handing me tools and holding posts steady while I tamped the earth around them. When we finished, he walked the entire length of the new fence line, running his hand along the wire the way he had done when I was a child, and he was teaching me the shape of our land. He stopped at the corner nearest the oak tree where my mother's ashes were scattered and stood there for a long time without speaking. That evening, we sat on the porch as the sun went down, the same way we had done 100 times before. The tomato beds had been replanted, and the first green shoots were beginning to push through the soil. No tire tracks had appeared since the hearing. No survey crews, no letters, no visits from anyone claiming authority they didn't possess. The fields stretched out before us in the golden light, unchanged and unchangeable, belonging to my family the way they always had. My father asked if I thought Sandra would ever try something like this again. I told him I doubted it. People like her only push as hard as they think they can get away with, and she had learned the limits of what was possible when someone pushes back with documentation instead of anger. He nodded slowly and said that boundaries weren't just lines on a map. They were promises, he said. Promises about what belongs to you and what nobody has the right to take. I thought about that as the stars came out and the night settled over the farm. I thought about my grandfather, who had kept records of every injustice until he had enough to make it official. I thought about my mother, who had planted seeds in this soil and trusted that someone would tend them after she was gone. And I thought about my father, who had endured a year of harassment without complaint because he believed that eventually, somehow, the truth would matter. The fence was rebuilt, the boundary was clear, and the record was permanent. That was the only victory that mattered. Some battles aren't won with fists. They're won with patience, with paperwork, and with the quiet refusal to let someone take what doesn't belong to them. If this story reminded you that boundaries matter, that documentation beats intimidation, and that the truth has a way of catching up with people who think they're untouchable, then you're exactly who this channel was made for. Here at Karma Fence, we share stories of ordinary people who stood their ground when the world told them to back down, people who chose process over anger, evidence over emotion, and dignity over defeat. If you believe that justice should be earned, not bought, hit that subscribe button and join us for the next story. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to defend your boundaries against someone who thought the rules didn't apply to them? I'd love to hear how you handled it. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to know that standing firm is always worth it. The fence is built, the record is permanent, and karma always finds its way home.